Nicole sat on the windowsill and thought about how complicated life is. Her high school graduation was coming up, and she didn't know what to do next. Nicole dreamed of getting some kind of profession, but her strict, perpetually dissatisfied father was unlikely to let her go to the city to study. More than anything, she wanted to become independent and get out of this poverty. And Nicole really missed her mother. She died when the girl was 15 years old, and since then she has lived with her father. Nicole felt from early childhood that he didn't love her at all, but she didn't understand why. The girl was the only child in the family. She grew up quiet and modest girl who never showed her tears to anyone. Her mother was also strict and demanding, so Nicole always got straight A's in school. Education was easy for the girl, but she had no friends. Parents rarely brought her new things, so she often became an object of ridicule by classmates. A couple of times she tried to talk about it with her mother and father, but they only grudgingly waved her off. After her mother's death, Nicole missed her very much, because despite her strict character, her mother really loved her. Hearing heavy footsteps, Nicole, wiping away her tears, jumped down from the windowsill a second before her father appeared on the threshold of the room. "Why are you sitting there?" her father shouted at her. "Do I have to do everything around the house by myself?" "Now, Daddy," said Nicole, and quickly jumped up from the couch. Her father looked at Nicole with a frown and added, a little more quietly, that Cora was coming to visit them tonight, and not just to visit, but to stay here. Nicole almost suffocated with indignation. She thought painfully that since her mother's death it had not even been 2 years, and her father was about to remarry. Cora worked as a saleswoman at the local store, and though she was good-looking, she had an absolutely obnoxious temper. "Daddy, you won't be happy with her." Nicole tried to dissuade him from making a mistake. "I did not ask your opinion. Go and take care of the household and ensure that everything is cleaned and supper is prepared." The father went out, slamming the door. Nicole wiped away her tears again, imagining what life awaited her, next to her stepmother, and sighing heavily, went to do the usual household chores. With a stepmother, Nicole's life became quite unbearable. One day, when her father once again yelled at her because of complaints from his new wife, Nicole could not stand it and asked, "Daddy, why do you hate me so much? I've disturbed you all my life and I can't understand why." Her father looked up at her hard and said something that made the girl first pale, then blush, and in the next minute she rushed to pack her things, and in an hour she was already standing at the bus stop, leaving her home forever. 3 years passed. Nicole moved to the city, got a job as a cleaner in a large company, and settled in a rented room with a modest, intelligent elderly woman, Mrs. Brooke. She never saw her father again, never even called him. She was sure he did not need it. Over the years, Nicole never acquired any friends or a boyfriend. She did not aspire to have any fun, but this quiet life suited her well, and she never complained. Mrs. Brooke was curious about the girl's reclusive lifestyle, and once again had a conversation with her on the subject. "Why do you live like a real recluse? And this is at your age?" The kind elderly lady exclaimed worriedly, "Yes, I just dislike noisy companies since childhood," explained Nicole. "Besides, not all people can understand and accept the fact that I work as an ordinary cleaner. Once I met a man. He was good-looking. He was a manager. But as soon as he found out where I worked, he lost interest in me right away." "So why don't you change your job?" the elderly lady continued to interrogate. "You know, Mrs. Brooke, it is not easy to get a good job now, even those who have higher education, and I only have a high school diploma, even with honours. Where can I find a normal job? And I'm already used to the company and to Mr. Richardson." "And who is Mr. Richardson?" "Mr. Richardson is the director of the company where I work. He's a strict man, but I usually clean in the morning before he gets here, so he hardly knows I even exist. Tomorrow some serious delegation is arriving, and I have been asked to clean even earlier than usual. So, good night, Mrs. Brooke. I'm going to bed. I have to get up early tomorrow." The next morning, Nicole quickly completed the cleaning of the offices and decided to handle the flowers in the lounge. The young woman was wiping a ficus leaf when Mr. Richardson literally flew into the room out of anger. He was reprimanding his deputy Paul, who came in after and didn't even notice that there was someone else in the room. "I will fire you, do you understand? Our Turkish colleagues will be here any minute, and we don't have an interpreter. Mr. Sahin specifically asked me to do this because their interpreter is sick. Is there anything I can assign you to do at all?" "I found us an interpreter, but he's late on the road." Paul tried to justify himself. "That's not my problem. What am I supposed to do now?" shouted enraged Mr. Richardson, and left the room slamming the door loudly. Paul hurried after the boss, and a frightened Nicole decided to go to the accounting department and clean there until everything calmed down. But just as she stepped out into the corridor, she bumped into Mr. Richardson and Paul again, and now they were accompanied by 5 Turkish colleagues. Mr. Richardson apologized with a bewildered look and tried to explain to the guests that the interpreter would be here soon, but they looked at him confused and have already begun to whisper anxiously. Nicole listened to what they were saying. Then, leaving the bucket and mop, she resolutely approached the delegation. She greeted them in Turkish, introduced herself, and turning to Mr. Richardson, offered her help. Eventually, by the time the official interpreter arrived, the negotiations had already come to an end, and Paul came out to meet him and said that they no longer needed his services. The man, without even thinking to apologize, indignantly warned that he was the only licensed Turkish interpreter in their town. Paul laughed in response and assured the smug insolent that this was no longer true, and even the cleaner in their company knew Turkish better than he did. In half an hour, having accompanied the guests to the car and agreed to continue the meeting in the restaurant, Mr. Richardson sincerely thanked Nicole for such a wonderful rescue, and then he told her that she would have to go with him to the restaurant. He offered her to go home and change her clothes, but Nicole, smiling embarrassedly, said that she did not have the appropriate clothes for such an occasion. Just then Mr. Richardson came to his senses and, frowning, carefully looked at the woman. "I didn't think of that. You're a cleaning lady, aren't you?" "I do not understand. A cleaning lady and suddenly the Turkish language. And your face seems familiar to me. We have never seen each other before. Where are you from? And your name is so unusual." Seeing how Nicole averted her eyes, confused, Mr. Richardson invited her into his office, where he insisted that she tell him everything about herself. "I spent all my childhood in a small village, but it's been a few years since I left there, and now I live here. My mother died. She was the one who gave me this name." Mr. Richardson sighed and said sadly, "My wife also died before she could give me a child. You know, I blame myself for being without a child in the end. Once I gave up my own son. I lost him. Then I looked for him, but it was no use. His mother Helen and I were not married, but I loved her. We broke up because of a stupid quarrel. She was jealous of me, and I did not apologize, offended by her lack of trust. Helen was going to give birth to a boy, and she promised to name him after my father. I don't know why I'm telling you all this, but I would like to see my son so much," said Mr. Richardson sadly. "Would you like to see your daughter, maybe?" asked Nicole in a trembling voice. Mr. Richardson looked at her with an incomprehensible look, and then the girl told him everything. It turned out that Helen did not give birth to a son, but to a daughter, and named her Nicole. Yes, the girl turned out to be Mr. Richardson's daughter, and she found out about it on that ill-fated day, during a quarrel with her father, who was in fact her stepfather. He told her the whole truth then, and in confirmation he gave her a file with her mother's documents. Among other things, there were letters and pictures where her mother had been with Mr. Richardson. Mr. Richardson listened to the young woman, put his arms around his head, and froze for a moment, trying to comprehend what he had heard. And then he walked over to Nicole and hugged his daughter tightly. "And how do you know Turkish?" Mr. Richardson suddenly asked. "I also know Spanish and German, and I'm learning French. Languages have always come easy to me. I don't even know why." "You're just like your grandfather. My father knew 6 languages," said Mr. Richardson, amazed, and hugged his daughter even tighter, still not believing in his happiness. Several years passed. All this time, the daughter was always close to Mr. Richardson, and then married his business partner and gave birth to a son. Mr. Richardson, with tears of joy in his eyes, held the precious baby and was finally happy.